All right, so hit the record button. I want to first of all, thank you guys for coming, but also thank Blair so much. Blair was a student in the program a couple years ago, but he's also just amazing when it comes to accounting and financial documents, not only in the thoroughness of which he presents them, but his graphic displays make it really easy to read and look at. And so I ask him every year to come back and give this lecture. And we decided to do it towards the end of the semester instead of at the front end, with the hopes that you guys are somewhere in the process of developing a business plan so that you might have more questions, or at least it'll make more sense in context for you. So I'm going to turn it over to Blair. I will ask you to introduce yourself, like who you work for, what you do, and then we'll just take it from there.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Bender. I'm Blair Northcott. I'm a partner with Grant Thornton, which is a large accounting firm, and I work a lot in the aquaculture sector with clients here in Eastern Canada, mostly on the salmon side, but I do some shrimp out of Central America and some sea bass and sea bream out of Spain with Canadian companies. And so the model I prepared for my course was actually based on salmon, but I'm just curious as to when people are looking at building a business plan, what types of species are they considering? Because I think that will kind of help me as I sort of walk through sort of how I build a business plan when I'm looking at this type of industry.
So why don't we just go kind of around the bend. And Richard, what species are you working on for your business plan?
I'm up in Washington, so I'm working on a Pacific oyster. That's very common and popular in this area. So
great. And Laura?
Hello, I'm looking to grow sugar kelp here in England.
Okay, interesting.
Great. And Arthur?
I'm looking into doing abalone in South Africa.
Tim?
I'm probably going to do sea cucumbers, which I know is different. I'm still trying to figure out if that's a good decision or not. But yeah,
this might help you decide. Right?
That's right.
And Jane?
I'm interested in both, thinking through it for oysters and for kelp as well.
Dante?
Just put it in chat, I think.
Oh
yeah,
growing
oysters
and mussels in Atlantic Canada.
Cool.
Okay, well, I think Blair is in Atlantic Canada too.
I am, yes. So yeah, there is a lot of oysters in Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, in this part of the world. There's also some kelp taking place as well. I haven't seen cucumbers before. And abalone, what I'm just trying to think, is that similar to tuna?
No, it's a hard shell, but Arthur, I'll let you talk about it.
Yeah.
So Arthur divides I think he's from Belgium, but he divides his time between Uganda and Zambia.
Okay,
but I think he's thinking of doing this in South Africa.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, no, I'm from the Netherlands,
Yeah.
not Belgium. But indeed, I'm in Uganda and Zambia most of the time, so I want to do something here on the continent. Yeah, the abalone business, it does quite well in South Africa. So I was thinking about that, and it is shellfish indeed.
Okay.
It's like a sea snail.
Okay.
Basically.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, there is a lot of aquaculture in Uganda. I know it's on the continent. I think Nigeria and Uganda are probably two of the leading countries in aquaculture in Africa. So I find that it's very, very interesting. So, and there's growing aquaculture in Namibia and in Angola as well. So it's just through how I follow the industry and look at where some of the growth activity is taking place. So I think, like I did last time, Dr. Benders, maybe I'll just walk through kind of the business plan, probably in two parts. Is in terms of writing a business plan, the first thing I did was I did a PowerPoint presentation, and I kind of mapped out everything that, based on my experience, that I knew would be involved in building a business plan for a salmon farming business. And from there, I was able to come up with the assumptions, and then I just modeled everything out in Excel, and I'll walk it through. If you have any questions, just let me know. But I'm just going to try to figure out how to share my screen here. I'm more familiar with Teams and Zoom, so.
Oh, I need to help you share your screen.
Okay.
Hang on, where are you? I'll make you a co-host, and which is all set, so you can share. Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries.
So people posted some additional comments in the chat. Someone's doing salmon in the US, so that this should be really helpful. Someone else works at USDA and NRCS to work with oyster farmers and farming for restoration. So that's kind of super interesting as well.
Yeah, cool. For the salmon in the US, what part are you, of the country are you looking at?
Feel free to unmute yourself and chat, or you can put it in the chat, whatever. Sometimes people are calling in from work, so
Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
I'm never sure. And I picked this time because I've got people all over the world, so I'm always trying to figure out what's the best time.
Yeah.
It just says USA.
Okay. Can everyone see that?
No.
What's going on?
Sometimes you have to drag. I haven't had to do this in a while. So are you not on an Apple?
No, I'm not.
All right. So is anyone here not use Apples? I think you can sometimes drag from one to another. No. Okay, AO, there we are. AO. So where in the US are you growing your salmon? This is me doing 20 things at once. So you go pull up the image on your screen, and then if you go to share screen, it should show it to us.
So, okay, yeah, I've done that. So if I go to share screen, that is, okay.
But we still aren't seeing it.
Okay,
So sometimes I know when I've used a PC, I've had to, you guys remember this, where you have to go in and you have to say like mimic screen? Do you know that? Yeah, Jane's nodding her head.
Okay.
It's like, so I haven't done it in so long that I can't barely remember it, but.
So if I open the document I have, and then if I go to share screen, it's not showing up.
Not showing for us. So you might have to do like duplicate screen or something like that.
Here we go.
Ah, yay. There it is. I can't believe I remembered something. It still works
That's
after.
good. Yeah. So this was my business plan from May of 2020. And so there's about 74 slides here, and I'll walk through them at a high level. And I think my goal here would just be to illustrate kind of how I thought through the business plan before I got into doing the math in Excel. So again, I based it on salmon in Atlantic Canada. And so I use a lot of my own knowledge with, I have over 15 years of experience in the global aquaculture industry. And there's also a lot of good stuff on the internet, such as various government websites, because generally in most jurisdictions, aquaculture is regulated. There's a lot of good articles and other publications out there. And so I did indicate throughout my business plan kind of the sources that I use. So, and I just used a template that was available in the course, and that seemed to work fine. So typical things in a business plan: executive summary, company description, what the company's going to do, analysis of the industry, market analysis, competition, marketing and sales, operations, management and the organization, the capitalization structure, development milestones, risks and contingencies, and then leading into the financial projections. So in any business plan for a greenfield aquaculture operation, this is typically the type of analysis you would go through. So coming up with, what is your business concept? So I've heard people talk about Pacific oysters, sugar kelp, abalone, sea cucumbers, salmon. So it's, what is your concept? And then you start to sort of fill in, looking at geography, and then sort of, looking at where the market is going to be. So my business concept was Atlantic salmon farming based in the province of Newfoundland, Labrador, Canada, focusing on organic grown salmon, and based in the fact that aquaculture will provide healthy protein to the world's growing population. The province of Newfoundland and Labrador has 17,000 kilometers of coastline and has potential for expansion. Salmon's very well developed and is in demand in North America and around the world. And certain areas of the world, and there's no different here in Canada, governments are providing financial incentives to help people get started in aquaculture. And I've even seen that in Europe with the country Turkey providing government incentives to support new sea bream and sea bass operations. The next thing I did was just looked at sort of how I was going to structure it in terms of it was going to be a company, looking at who was going to own the company, and then where the operations were going to be located geographically in the province, and also looking at that it was going to be a vertically integrated business. So that means it was going to operate everything from hatchery to operations to saltwater production, processing, and controlling all parts of the aquaculture process as opposed to outsourcing certain parts. Then I looked at the market potential. So in 2019, the global salmon market reached a volume of 3.8 million tons. It's expected to reach 4.9 million tons by 2025. Global salmon industry is worth over 15 billion USD. And salmon is a good source of omega-3 fatty acids. And then, so looking at geographically where I was going to be setting up the operations, then considering where the primary markets were going to be, United States, Canada, and Asia. So if you're farming abalone in South Africa, then you'd be looking at, okay, well, am I going to sell it just in South Africa, or am I going to sell it to other countries on the African continent? Then I looked at what the management team was going to be, and then that sort of just helped with some costs, as we'll see later. And I just built these titles just out of my own experience in the industry. Then I then I get into what's the capital requirements going to be? What is the funding going to be required to get this off the ground? So my plan was to develop 10 farm sites with all required infrastructure, to have my own hatchery operations, purchase some existing capacity, processing capacity, and sort of invest in that. Have a head office location. So it's a significant amount of capital. So in my plan, I went very big, and I expected the initial capital requirements to be over 100 million Canadian, and we'll see that when we get into the projections. And then just looking at an exit strategy, once I built the business, I was, at some point would sell it and get out of the industry. In terms of the company description, I got in a little more detail here in terms of a mission statement, to produce healthy and sustainable grown organic salmon to feed the world's growing population. So I had the business concept, I had a high level assessment of the market, I knew where there was some capital coming from, and then I just had to figure out how to get the rest of the capital. And one thing with aquaculture, particularly in the salmon business, is capital is needed up front. It's a capital intensive business, but also with salmon, it's probably a year or two before you have product to harvest, to sell. So just thinking about the capital up front, where you're going to get it, and how are you going to sustain the business while you're growing your product, until you can get stuff ready to the market to sell. So I was looking at salmon, organic salmon, which you can get a premium price for in the market, and that's a big thing these days, around, throughout a lot of different aquaculture is organically produced product, and that tends to allow suppliers to charge a much higher premium in the market. So the objectives of the business, the key to success. So when you look at what you're proposing to build, whether it's Pacific oysters or kelp or sea cucumber, what are going to be the keys to have a successful business? For me, it was development of a solid business plan, obtaining government support that was available, identifying geographically and where I was going to be located, what the ideal environmental conditions were going to be, how I'm going to raise the capital, how I'm going to attract and retain key management talent, how I'm going to distinguish the company from the competition, and then focusing on sustainability and a high quality biosecurity program. And in the aquaculture business, biosecurity is a big thing, because if you get disease and you lose your crop, generally insurance will cover certain types of biosecurity events, but it can be devastating if you're starting out and you lose your first crop and don't have any product to sell. Looked at, again, I talked about location and facilities. Then I looked at the entry barriers. If you look at the various concepts that people described earlier, and you start thinking about geography, then you have to think about what are the entry barriers. So as I mentioned earlier, in Canada, the aquaculture industry is very highly regulated, both provincially or which would be state-wise for people in the US, and also federally. And so there is, and it's very capital intensive to get it going. And generally, with salmon business, it's going to be 18 to 24 months before you get salmon ready to harvest. So you have to have the capital to be able to get through those first 2 years. And there's a lot of competition. Over the years in the salmon business, there's been a lot of consolidation in industries, a lot of big players. So you know, if you're starting out new, you know, you'll have to compete, you know, against global companies, at least here in Atlantic Canada. So I did an industry analysis. I looked at supply and distribution, how generally the two distribution channels, which is food service network and the retail distribution network. And through COVID, it's been really interesting in not just the salmon business, but early on in COVID, the food service network channel really shut down as restaurants and weren't open, and other facilities were shut. Although on the salmon side, we did see a pickup in the retail distribution network through the pandemic because people were buying salmon from the supermarkets. So typically, the food in the salmon business, the food service network tends to be the most profitable in terms of, you know, supplying salmon to restaurants and hotels, and so you generally get higher prices and higher margins than you do from the supermarket chain. But that's an important consideration. You're growing your product, and how are you going to get it to market? What's going to be the challenge at which you're going to be able to get that product through to consumers? Looked at technological factors, what innovation was happening. So, and that affects cost in terms of building the business plan. Looking at seasonality, is there going to be a seasonality aspect to the business? Like, can you only grow oysters at a certain time of the year? Look at the economic influences. You know, what's demand like in general around the world, and so what broader economic influences could impact the business. Regulatory oversight, as I mentioned earlier. Then I looked at the market in more detail, the overall market, the potential for the market to grow, and in the case of not just salmon, but I would say aquaculture in general, from a protein perspective, is really growing. I looked at market trends. Climate change. Climate change is a big thing these days, and there's been a lot of comparison to the environmental impact of aquaculture for protein versus beef or chicken or pork. So there's a lot of research on that. Looked at the market segments, whether it was fresh, frozen, geography, the distribution channels, targeting the segment, how is the product going to be delivered. Looked at the customer characteristics and needs. So when it comes to seafood, there's a big demand for identifiable sustainable products. There's a lot of seafood certification programs out there that and consumers are looking for seafood that is been certified as sustainable or sustainable production. There is a demand for healthy protein, high in omega-3s, convenience, value for money, and so these are things that you think of when you think of who is going to buy your product. How you will position your product so that you can compete. Looked at the competition, larger players here in the salmon business, being in Norway and Chile and Scotland. Look at market share that competitors add in North America. Looked at future competitors. How is the industry evolving, so that are there competitors out there in the future that aren't there today just because the methodology used is going to change. Looked at the competitive evaluation of the product. Looked at marketing and sales. Looked at the product mix. Looked at pricing. So on pricing, I was able to get really good information from the internet. There's lots of websites out there with pricing for all kinds of aquaculture products. Looked at distribution. I would promote it. where the sales force was going to be, what the sales forecasts were going to look like, what the operations were going to look like. In my case, it was hatchery, so controlling the product right from the start of salmon eggs, saltwater operations. And in each of these areas, I kind of thought about using research that was available and my own knowledge of what it was going to cost to develop these. In my case, it was 10 sites. I looked at what were going to be the resource requirements in terms of personnel to run 10 aquaculture sites, and this was based on my knowledge of the industry. Looked at what it was going to cost to control the harvesting and processing operations, quality control. Looked at what was going to be required for administration, and as I said, this is a big scale model. Looked at product development and risks. Some of the key risks are susceptibility to disease, and negative weather conditions, and an inaccurate assessment for the consumer demand. Looked at what the key suppliers are going to be to run aquaculture operations. Looked at more detail in terms of product delivery, customer service, the HR plan, management team, board of directors, and looked at how the capitalization and structure. So it was going to be a limited company. It was 60% owned by me, 40% owned by family members. Looking at this, really got into how I was going to raise the capital outlay of about 100 million Canadian, where the money was going to come from to start the business up. So, and that's really important, depending on, size of aquaculture business you're looking at. I envision, as a CEO, I would be injecting about 3 million Canadian dollars. And so other family members would invest, so 4 million Canadian. The province of Newfoundland would match that, 5 million. And then we'd require bank financing of probably up to 75 million. And so that would really, you really need to have a solid business plan if you're going to investors or to lenders to look for money. Exit strategy, which I talked about, is that my plan was to grow the business profitability and spin it off in 10 years and sell it. Looked at some development milestones. So this is just a timeline of when things were going to happen. So basically, I was looking at starting it in May of 2020, and that really first time I would achieve profitable operations would be 2025. So just having the capital to build and sustain for the first 5 years until I started harvesting product. Risks and contingencies, looking at all the things that could go wrong. And then I built the financial projections consisting of a balance sheet, an income statement, a cash flow statement. And that was all based off key assumptions, which came from all the material that I've presented so far, such as the capital outlay that was required, the site capacity. So how much product can I generate on each site? What's it going to cost to in case of salmon, a smoke cost, which is a small fish that eventually you put in the salt water. How much it was going to cost to grow these salmon to market size, what the mortality rate was going to be, because if you put 1 million salmon in salt water, then a certain percentage of them will die. Looked at processing costs, processing yields, looked at the forecasted salmon prices, and then also looked at forecasted inflation. So I took that, and then I took all these data and all these assumptions, and then I built using Excel, I built a financial model of projected financial statements, of income statements, balance sheets, and cash flow statements. So maybe before I get into that, maybe I'll just stop and see if anyone has any questions.
That's great. You guys can either just raise your hand or raise the emoji for a hand. But
Yeah.
sorry, choking. No, you guys are ready for.
Okay, let's see if I can share my screen again. I'll just
Uh-oh, you have to remember what you did now.
yeah, I know.
I have to remember what I told you to do. Like mimic screen or something.
Can everyone see that? Can everyone see the Excel model okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Great, great. So I looked at when I built this, and there's sort of just using formulas and a bunch of different different sheets there. So I took all the assumptions that I made about the business, and then I sort of built this out over 10 years. And so everything in this Excel model is from the income statements and the balance sheets is all linked to this page of assumptions. And so I'll sort of go through these assumptions, and then I'll sort of walk through and show you how they kind of get to the different types of financial statements. So the first thing I did was look at the ARIS assumptions for salmon. And I said, okay, I'm going to put salmon in 2020. It's going to take 24 months before they're going to be the size that the market likes. And so I had 10 sites. So I was going to stock each site with 1 million smolts, small salmon. So that would be the capacity. And I would stagger due to fallow requirements. So here in Canada, it's very strict that if you put fish in a site, because of environmental rules, once you harvest that site out, you have to let a year pass before you can put more fish back in, just to allow the site some environmental recovery. I anticipated that of all the salmon I put in, that 5% were going to die on an annual basis. I expected that the yield for whole fish, so in terms of the product I would have to sell, would be 85% of the live weight of the fish. And if it was being for products that were more value added, such as fillets or portions, that the yield would be 60% of live weight. And so based on the stocking plan, I expected that I would harvest starting in 2022 with 3 sites because of the way I was staggering the fish going in, and that I estimated that the grow out would be 18 to 24 months. So the model uses 24 months. So then I look at, just to the right of that, I have the estimated harvestable product. So starting in 2022, I would have 3 million fish would have went in, based on 5% mortality on an annual basis. That it was going to be roughly about 2.5 million ready to harvest, and based on a harvest weight of 5 kgs, that was going to be about 12.8 million kgs. Based on how I was going to sell it, whole fish, I would have about 2.75 million kgs. based on the portion that I thought was going to go into fillets, about 3.8 million kgs, and then value added about 2 million kgs. So of the 3 million fish that went in, 500,000 roughly were going to die due to just the mortality that we see in the salmon industry. I would have about 13 million kgs to harvest, and out of that, in terms of actual product that I could sell once the salmon had been processed, would be roughly about 8.5 kgs. And so then I kind of kept that consistent, and I didn't factor in sort of any growth in terms of sites. I just said, okay, I'm going to have 10 sites, and it's roughly going to be the hopefully the same amount each year. In Canada, it's very difficult to get new sites approved, just under regulation. So typically, for companies that want to grow in the industry now, it's really through mergers and acquisitions. So they acquire other existing capacity who have site licenses from government. So those are the harvest assumptions. So this is what I'm going. So roughly each year, starting in 2022, I'm going to have about 8.5 million kgs to sell to the market. So then I looked at the sales assumptions. So I assume inflation was going to continue on at 2%, although these days it's probably more closer to the 5 or 6% with what's happening with inflation around the world. A price for a whole fish, $13 Canadian per kilogram, and that's just based on data that I was able to get from the internet, from a salmon market report out of Norway. Looked at the price for fillets and then price for further processing of value added. So then the math was just multiplying the products. So in this case, for whole fish, 2.7 million kgs multiplied by $13 per kg for a whole fish. And so then that gave me revenue of 35 million. In terms of fillets, it was about 3.8 million pounds, $19 a kg for that product, about 73 million in revenue. And the value added, same thing. Looked at the kgs that I was harvesting and then times the price. And then each year I built in inflation going out, and the total revenue each year is getting up, north of 150 to 171 million. In Canadian dollars, in terms of cost of goods sold, I looked at some studies that were available in aquaculture journals in 2019, and in terms of and these were in US dollars, so I used an exchange rate that was relevant at the time. But then in terms of growing salmon, on a per kg basis, this was data that I found out of Norway and looked at smolt, feed, labor, depreciation, harvest, and packing. So if you look at, if you're growing Pacific oysters, what's the cost going to be if you're using kg or pounds, to get those grown out to a size to get to market. And so in my case, I broke everything down and said that, it really was going to cost just about $6 US a kg, $8 Canadian. And then the premium for organic, I put 15%, and that's generally what I would see in the market. And then I said the same thing for value add. And then based on the kgs that I was going to harvest, that really was going to cost about 950 Canadian per kg of harvestable product. And so in that case, 26 million for whole fish, 39 million for fillet, 19 million for value add. So about 84 million. So as you can see, once this business gets up and going, the revenue is really going to see the cost of sales. So we're going to have a good margin. Then I looked at sales and general admin expenses, and there was data available in terms of what that looked like on average that I got from the internet per kg. And then I just estimated administration costs for each year. I built in some income tax assumptions saying if I make a profit, I'm going to pay 29% income tax in Canada. And then the next part is looking at capital investment. And so this was data I was able to get again from research, and sort of looked at, you know, what it costs to what the capital costs were going to be to establish a salmon farming site. So it was roughly about 8.5 million Canadian per site, so roughly about 85 million. And then I looked at just at some other capital costs. So really total capital costs were about $1 million. Then I looked at how that was going to be financed. You know, 75 million through asset-based financing, which is long-term debt. Also needed a line of credit for the first couple of years to get the operations going. And then I looked at, so the required equity was going to be, so for capital equipment was going to be 101 million. Working capital for year 1 and year 2, because remember I'm running the operations, I'm growing the fish, I'm not getting any revenue, so I need to fund those operating costs. So estimated over 2 years, they're going to be about 85 million. And then the administration costs are going to be 43 million. So total costs of 229 million dollars to sustain this business over the first 2 years. So bank financing and then equity. So bank financing was about 160 million, and then equity was being built, was just through outside investors and my own capital investing. So all these numbers then get, as I move into building an income statement for 10 years. So the first 2 years I have no revenue, but I know I'm going to have roughly about 22 million in operating costs just as I'm growing the salmon. And once the salmon are harvested, we have a gross margin of 64 million, 23 million of costs. And so mine's a big plan, so it's going to be very profitable, and it just shows how the earnings are going to go out over the 10 years. And at the end of the day, it's going to be a very profitable business, looking at all the different components going in, and then just mapping the results of these calculations and assumptions into the income statement. Then the balance sheet. So I just looked at so from the projected income statement, I knew what, in terms of investment in biological assets, was going to be. I knew that it was about 91 million of capital equipment. That's 101 million less 9 million of depreciating it roughly over 10 years. So total assets of 206 million. Bank financing of 92.5 million plus 60 million. And then the equity. And then you can see in the red, the first 2 years, I'm not making any money. And then as the business gets profitable, I'm building cash. accounts receivable in terms of, I put some assumptions in terms of when, my sales are going to be collected. What I was going to have invested in biological assets, which is the growing of the fish, the capital equipment. So then each year came up with total assets. Also had liabilities, what they were going to be, and then equity. So in accounting, from a balance sheet perspective, total assets equal your total liabilities plus your equity. So I think of it in this terms of I have 206 million in assets. I really borrowed 152 million to be able to get those assets, and then I had equity or investors coming in for another 54 million, and then just using formulas, picking up the earnings from each year, it just moves through and updates. So it's really just once you get the initial year set up, then it's just copying across and building the formulas out, and that's so most of the work is really is thinking through what you're going to do and what are going to be the inputs that you're going to require. And once you have that, it's you can just map things out. And if you're using Excel and getting the formulas, but really the work in doing the business plan is the thought process. Okay, if I'm going to grow Pacific oysters, what size of operation am I going to have? What are going to be the costs required? And then when I get product to sell, what are going to be the prices? So it's really thinking about all the inputs you need and then mapping those out from a cost perspective and then building that out. In this case, it was a 10-year business plan. And I was very optimistic and I was going to make a lot of money. But yeah, so that's the exercise. And does anyone have any questions at all?
It's a heck of an exercise, but Jane's like, ay. But the thing is, Blair presented his numbers so clearly that I thought no matter what we do in life and what job we have, that actually understanding this and getting a little bit of extra time on putting together what a balance sheet looks like would be helpful in anything that we're doing, whether it's just a household situation. So so I believe your business plan is on the fish site, that we have a couple, a file with the business plans that we thought were great. And so it's accessible. You guys can see it. You can find it. Blair has made himself, I don't know if he's still super available, but he's made himself available in the past. If you have questions, if you want him
absolutely.
to read anything, he's happy to help you with that. And you definitely want him to help you on the accounting section rather than me. But I appreciate you guys coming. I appreciate Blair's time. So are there any questions at all?
I do have one quick question. So I saw in your assumptions, you accounted for 5% mortality just based on kind of generally what mortality would be for salmon.
Yeah.
One thing I'm thinking about is the kind of risk in which you had, and again, like your risks and your contingencies, which was like weather, disease, but like a mass death incident, right? How do you kind of think about those, especially when this is a field where those happen, right? I mean, where entire crops get wiped out, where you might lose a good portion of your crop in a given year or even subsequent years.
So
that's a good question.
Before he answers that, I want to say, did you get to see Paul Russell's video? Maybe, okay. Just because there is a big kind of risk component to any agriculture, aquaculture.
And so in Canada, there's a couple of different programs. So obviously, anyone getting into this business, insurance. So there is crop insurance available. So that is a key thing, because I have seen big big losses where, and the other part is connected to and would be similar in the US. We have the Canadian Food Inspection Agency
Mhm.
in Canada. And so because of traceability of food, the industry is very, very regulated. So if you were to lose your crop, like, so say it was a natural disaster, a storm or something that wiped out, or a certain type of disease, um, then you could collect the insurance on it, on the product, to help continue in business. But I've seen cases in Canada where the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has come in and said, okay, there's a certain disease in this salmon in this area, and we require you to call those fish. They're not going to market. And so in that case, in Canada, if the CFIA comes in and says you need to call your fish, they'll pay you based on from a government program based on an amount per fish,
Yeah.
to compensate you for that loss. So that's something you need to think through, because you're growing live animals and they do die, and
Mhm.
environmental disasters do happen, and especially with food traceability, that is a big risk in the business, because with traceability. So I sit here in Atlantic Canada, and someone was in a nice restaurant in New York tonight, and they had salmon and they got sick. They between Canada and the US and the FDA, they have to be able to trace that back to the exact location where that salmon was farmed, was harvested. It's a quite complex part of the business with food tracing.
So in your projections, you would just basically account for what the likely percent kind of
Yeah,
coverage of the insurance. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I didn't really build in sort of the contingency of a loss of a major
Yeah.
loss. I just used sort of average mortality rates that I've
Right.
seen over the years. So in some areas of Atlantic Canada, they'd be much higher. In some areas, they'd be much
Interesting.
lower. It's really the environmental conditions that impact
Yeah.
it. So some areas, you'd have just of water temperature, water currents. You'd have higher mortalities, whereas in another area where the water environmental conditions are probably a little better, you'd have less mortality. So
Yeah.
it does vary, and the farmers know, like over the years, they generally will be able to know on average, the areas where they put fish in, what types of mortalities they're going to get. So they balance it out, so they know
Okay.
kind of,
Yeah.
if
That
you're
makes
going to get
sense.
10% in one area and 2% in the other, then it is a complex exercise to go through.
I mean, there's market interruptions too, like COVID. So
Right. Right.
Yes. Yeah, COVID was really, really interesting, because on the salmon side, as I said earlier, the the food service side of the business just stopped, right? Uh, all the restaurants were closed. I think if you're in Canada, all the restaurants are closed. Any institutions such as universities and other types of entities that would buy salmon, it all stopped, and so the retail sector did pick up some of that, but with you're getting better prices through the food service network, through restaurants and that. So with the large supermarket chains, you get pricing pressure as well, because that's the only option you had to sell the product at that point. And you can't keep, with livestock, you can't keep it in, at some point you have to harvest it. And so to harvest it, you need to sell it. And in salmon, there was a lot of frozen fish occurring in the, I guess when the pandemic started, because you had to get the fish out of the water. But generally, frozen salmon, really, the prices are much lower than it would be for fresh. So there's a lot of contingency and thinking through as to what can go wrong.
Also been like a huge movement towards smoked and canned product now. And you have to think like what happened in the market to bring the whole concept of canning back, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
So we have a few minutes, like 5 minutes at the most left. If anyone has any questions, speak now. Otherwise, I'm really appreciative of your time, Blair. And I actually have something for you before you hang up. But if everyone else is good, then I'll stop the recording and you guys can